throughout the lifespan of kind of the fertile female, as an example, there should be kind of, perhaps not so much PMS going on. There should be an easy or a relatively easy ability to get pregnant, maintain pregnancy or gestation, and produce healthy babies. And, I think the incidence that we're seeing with decreased fertility, increased issues around the menstrual cycle, as I said, whether it's PCOS, I think they're a reflection of what drives into poor kind of menopausal symptoms, whether it's increased, insomnia, whether it's hot flushing, whether it's kind of irritability, mood changes, decreasing and loss of menstrual cycle. And I think it kind of all converges again with the points around high estrogen, which can be a real problem. And also that the often neglect and just loss of mentioning that the fact that your ovaries aren't they're starting to fail, that not me, but ladies aren't producing enough progesterone. And if you understand that what progesterone is and does, you can get a better idea of why a lot of women don't need to suffer during the menopause.
Welcome to The Body Never Lies. I'm your host, Littlewood. Each week, myself and experts from around the world help you uncover the secret ways your body communicates with you to empower you in your own individual health journey. I'm so sorry to say that you guys have been asking for this episode for ages, and it has taken Tommo and I quite a long time to get to it, so I apologise. I know there really isn't enough great info out there about menopause, but that is slowly changing, and I hope Tommo's amazing wealth of knowledge really helps you today. For those of you who don't know, Keith Littlewood, aka Tommo, is a friend and mentor of mine and has fast become our resident hormonal expert. He's currently doing his PhD in endocrinology, the study of hormones, and would love your support and for you to donate to his GoFundMe. And if you have not listened to his previous episodes, you're going to find out why his work is so important. There is a significant amount of misinformation and poor applications in medicine in relation to hormonal replacement therapy, especially with thyroid, but also reproductive issues in general and menopause. Today we're going to be exploring those around menopause, especially the erroneous idea of estrogen being an appropriate application. We're going to really be talking about just why so many women suffer, some more than others, and I'm really hoping that this is going to be listened to by women of all ages, because it is in fact years of cumulative lifestyle and environmental factors that contribute to how we shall in fact go through the change and what our health will be like afterwards. So share this one with your daughters, your sisters and your mothers so that we can all live long, healthy lives with great bone mineral density, thyroids and muscle mass well beyond our menopausal years. Hi, Tommo. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. I don't think you need an introduction because you've been here so many times now, but thanks for coming back.
Good evening or good morning to you.
Good morning to me. Today, I'm going to ask Tommo, who's my go-to expert on all things hormones, about menopause, because you guys have been asking me so much about menopause. So I guess I think the thing that I'm hearing is a lot of women suffer through menopause, and I think that they shouldn't have to suffer. And so I'd really and there's not a lot of, as usual with all medical syndromes, and I'm saying that in air quote, there's not a lot of solutions. It's just it's the change, and you will go through the change and have hot flushes and stuff like that. So having you mentor me and using the work that you've taught me with my clients, I have seen some really good results doing metabolic work and thyroid and things like that for people going through menopause. So I wanted to get you on today because I really want to talk about, I think one of the problems is that as a society, as a culture, we don't actually understand the female menstrual cycle and the reproductive cycle that well, and how it goes from teens into menopause. Would you mind just giving us a kind of brief dummy's guide to that? Because I think that would help people understand why menopause is so painful, what it should be like, and then what it ends up being like because of the way the system is.
Sure. So, I mean, I think this also ties in really nicely with why do some women suffer from menopause worse than others? And that can always also come back to the teenage kind of onset of puberty, onset of the menstrual cycle. And I think it's kind of worth bearing in mind that the stresses that ladies might face, whether it's emotional, physical, chemical, they all kind of add up and converge and can cause problems at different parts of their lifespan. And we're getting to perhaps the dietary aspects, how that can even kind of make it worse, and, you know, exercise and hormones and the environment, crappy relationships and everything, you know, they all kind of build up. But, you know, during the kind of fertile years, obviously we have this very reasonably well set menstrual cycle that starts, and it's usually, you know, captured by the phase of the follicular phase, where you have kind of estrogens increasing, setting the scene. I like to kind of use the idea of estrogen as the kind of it's the weight training hormone that gets the uterus ready for implantation, ready for pregnancy. And then you kind of have the rise with the luteal phase, production of progesterone. You lead into ovulation, where the corpus luteum is released and the egg is kind of getting ready to be fertilized. We have a rush of progesterone still being produced into the ovulatory phase, and this should help to maintain the ability of the egg to be maintained and fertilized, and you know, implantation of the blasto, or the egg, the oocyte is, for example, is achieved, and this should be going on pretty much throughout life. I wouldn't say necessarily cessation of menstrual cycle is always characterized as a negative thing. I think a menstrual cycle should be there on a regular basis, but sometimes losing it occasionally for short periods of time without any kind of negative symptoms isn't necessarily bad. But when we start to see things like premenstrual syndrome, and we see all of the negative connotations associated with that, whether it's mood, irritability, swelling, cramping, pain, insomnia, blood sugar dysregulation, whether it's kind of increases in polycystic ovaries, endometriosis, fibroids, these are the kind of issues that are related to reproductive tissue that can lead into kind of worsening menopausal type symptoms. And I think the erroneous idea still that estrogen is always lost at menopause is a big problem, because it's not always the case. Throughout the lifespan of the fertile female, as an example, there should be kind of, you know, perhaps not so much PMS going on. There should be an easy or a relatively easy ability to get pregnant, maintain pregnancy or gestation, and produce healthy babies. And, you know, I think the incidence that we're seeing with decreased fertility, increased issues around the menstrual cycle, as I said, whether it's PCOS, I think they're a reflection of what drives into poor kind of menopausal symptoms, whether it's increased, you know, insomnia, whether it's hot flushing, whether it's kind of irritability, mood changes, decreasing and loss of menstrual cycle. And I think it kind of all converges again with the points around high estrogen, which can be a real problem. And also that the often neglect and just loss of mentioning that the fact that your ovaries aren't they're starting to fail, that not me, but ladies aren't producing enough progesterone. And if you understand that what progesterone is and does, you can get a better idea of why a lot of women don't need to suffer during the menopause. They don't need to suffer huge kind of or some significant changes to their mood. I think some things like the flushing can be a process for some, but they can be diminished substantially. And some clients I've spoken to have said, didn't even notice the menopause, wasn't a big deal at all. No issues at all. And I think to the extent that you've experienced, whether it's disordered eating as a teenager, a lot of stress, use of oral contraceptives, kind of loading up the liver with estrogens, as an example, living in polluted areas, excess exercise, all of these things that can converge and cause problems as you basically the ovaries start to fail. And that is often categorized again with the same phases where you tend to see bursts of follicle stimulating hormone producing that follicular phase, and then luteinizing hormone being produced more in the kind of progesterone based stage and ovulation, is that you will see increases in these pituitary hormones as the ovaries start to fail. And that's how blood tests will usually identify these increases in these hormones, primarily because there aren't enough circulating steroidal hormones. The ovaries aren't producing these steroidal hormones, and bearing in mind the ovaries should produce, estrogens, progesterone, small amounts of testosterone and DHEA, and the adrenal glands also can provide aspects of that as well. So it's interesting to see that as the ovaries do start to fail, what kind of symptoms tend to start to occur, and as we kind of mentioned there, the increase in the hot flashes is an example, which can come from a variety of sources. But if low blood pressure is often well categorized in females, and that can come from a number of things, from not eating enough food, not being able to mount a good response with kind of how, an automatic stress response, like standing up very quickly and feeling dizzy going from seated to standing. And that can come from interactions between estrogen. Estrogen can generally push when there's a larger, it acts as a vasodilator. And so it kind of it can make blood pressure a lot lower during these kind of more fertile years. But there is certainly cases now, and the idea, the suggestion was that you needed estrogen to prevent hypertension as you went into the menopause and out of it. There are plenty of cases now that show that excess sources of estrogen, perhaps like an HRT, do lead to kind of increases in blood pressure. So, there are issues where estrogen starts to kind of still have an overpowering effect. So as the ovaries lose production of progesterone, hot flashes can be still a multifactorial issue, whether it's estrogen still predominating over progesterone and causing also increases in nitric oxide to vasodilate. That can happen. And also, if that's chronic enough, the amount of estrogen that's in the body and affects the kidneys can lead to this kind of hypertensive state. So I think there are a number of things to be concerned around. And also the idea that just because you've hit the menopause and your ovaries are failing, again, the idea that estrogen is on the wane is probably quite erroneous. If a female has any kind of adipose tissue on their body, because the ability for aromatase to convert estrogen from testosterone and androgens is well known. So it's very unlikely that estrogen is completely lost. Now, I'll frame that by saying it's not a definite that estrogen is it's always in abundance. For some females, they can have a slight loss of estrogen, and there are, I think are ways of kind of ensuring that doesn't happen in certain symptoms. But again, these symptoms are kind of confusing, muddying with progesterone, thyroid as well. And again, as estrogen starts to increase, which it can do in the menopause, it can suppress thyroid physiology, it can suppress binding of T4 to the carrier proteins, it increases TSH and thyroid stimulating hormone. And this can be a negative effect because as estrogen increases, thyroid is suppressed. And when thyroid is suppressed, liver function is kind of decreased. We start to get increasing estrogen around the liver. This increases the amount of wasting of B vitamins, and you kind of get a sequelae of different problems that can occur. And whether that's kind of increasing cholesterol, increasing hypertension. And, one of the previous suggestions with estrogen as an example, that it was the cardioprotective factor. Now, you remember reading that is, women don't have as many heart attacks during childbearing years because of estrogen. But that actually found that when they looked at the big hormone replacement therapy studies, they actually found that kind of thrombosis and other cardiac events were quite well known. So I think it's just kind of one of the major premises of this is getting an idea that estrogen isn't always lost and it's not always essential to replace.
So it's interesting that you talk about the heart attacks, because I remember taking the pill and reading the packet, and it's saying that heart problems are one of the side effects of being on the pill, right?
Yeah.
Saying with stroke, like all of these things that are related to what you're saying, blood pressure issues, heart issues, so they're all side effects of taking the pill. I think that the pill's an interesting one to discuss.
As well as lost menstrual cycle.
So, because I still think the big point that people miss about the menstrual cycle is that the most important part of the menstrual cycle is ovulation. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So when ovulation occurs, you get this kind of mass, it's kind of waxy yellow substance from the corpus luteum, which is essentially, it's a very carotenoid and retinol rich structure. It's very, very vitamin A rich. And I think the reason behind that is because it helps for more progesterone to be kind of synthesized and produced. And so I think there used to be an erroneous idea in some of these women's magazines that ovulation was the source of premenstrual syndrome. And I'm like, that does not make any sense to me on any level if you understand what progesterone is and does. Progesterone is a very calming hormone. It's sometimes called the progestational hormone because it maintains pregnancy. It's generally why, we come back to blood pressure again, is that blood pressure levels often tend to go sometimes a bit lower during pregnancy. And, it's well known that women can feel a bit dizzier going seated to standing, as well as the other issues associated with energy and maintaining their pregnancy. But having adequate progesterone around, as I said, it helps to protect the egg and make sure that implantation and pregnancy is allowed to kind of progress. The very well-known common, time of, the first trimester when miscarriages are most well known to occur can be put down to kind of high estrogen and not having enough progesterone around. So there should be enough progesterone there from the corpus luteum to carry through, and then you should start producing more progesterone systemically, obviously from the ovaries as well, can be more from the adrenal glands. And I think that's one of the primary reasons why pregnancies often fail and also fail to progress to full term.
So why is it for a woman who's not interested in having children? Why is ovulation important?
For not having children? Well, I mean, having adequate progesterone can be quite useful for acting as a contraceptive. Adequate progesterone can, during the right phase, can prevent pregnancy occurring. But for not, if you weren't concerned about having children, I think getting your head around the idea that progesterone is the protective hormone is something that's quite important, because you'll see a plethora of kind of issues related to, even if a lot of women will kind of tend to report symptoms like, very sore breasts, cystic breasts, kind of very painful breasts. And sometimes that can occur both in the premenstrual phase running through into ovulation as well. And that's because there's not enough progesterone around. We know that progesterone's primary role or one of its roles is to act as an anti-estrogen. It stops the proliferative effects of estrogen during the cycle. So as I said, if you look at estrogen as this kind of it is like an anabolic hormone, because it leads, one of estrogen's primary growth is its tissue building. It promotes proliferation of tissue. When you get cut and you have a nasty wound, estrogen is often essential to create that wound healing. And the problem is when estrogen is unrestrained by, say, production of the corpus luteum, for example, failure to ovulate and ovulation, is that estrogen is allowed to run rampant and cause problems. It can promote angiogenesis. It synergizes with something called endothelial growth factor. So it promotes more blood vessels, and then you start to see more proliferation, more tissue going on. And this is the classic hallmark where you tend to see aspects like endometriosis, fibroids, polycystic ovary syndrome. Polycystic ovary is an easiest way to make a rodent polycystic ovaries is to inject it with estrogen, and you've got polycystic ovaries pretty much almost instantly. So there are a number of reasons why progesterone needs to be produced, but its primary role as an anti-estrogen and stopping the negative effects of estrogen growth, and also its effects with estrogen receptor, and the idea that, an excess of estrogen and estrogen receptors, which can also synergize with the environmental estrogens that you tend to find as well. These are kind of perhaps some of the issues that lead to metabolic issues and associated with mutation, potentially cancers, and why, certain contraceptives and lack of progesterone have been perhaps instrumental in increasing breast cancer and all of the other cancers that you tend to see, uterine fibroids, uterine cancers, ovarian cancer. I think, progesterone is the ultimate ovarian protectant, as it were, really. So I think that's probably one of the key reasons why ovulation does need to occur on a regular basis.
So does the amount of times that I ovulate, I can say I, does the amount of times that I ovulate or a woman ovulates throughout her life and the amount of progesterone she produces affects the side effects of menopause or how she will experience menopause?
Well, I think from some of the studies that kind of just ring a bell from what you just mentioned there is I think that women who've had more children tend to have less aggressive menopauses because they produce more progesterone. And perhaps, the thing is with estrogen as well is that sometimes we're assessing it by blood tests and even urine tests to a degree sometimes, and tests is that we can't actually measure how much are in the cells causing problems. And so we kind of go into menopause, and I say we collectively, you have these blood tests and the doctors will say, yes, this is where it's at, this is where it's at. Here we're seeing the elevations of follicle and luteinizing hormone. Is that, I think the symptoms are always going to be the most productive indicators of what's going on. So if you're having a really hard time, the blood tests aren't always going to kind of give you an idea of that. But I think if you've ovulated more regularly, if you've had children, as an example, I think the likelihood is going to be decreased. That's not to say that's set in stone by any means, because there are a number of reasons why some people might suffer worse. And, when you're, as I said, if you're in a stressful environment, there are multiple pollutants that act like estrogens, multiple pollutants that stimulate the estrogen receptor, multiple pollutants that stimulate proliferative pathways, multiple pollutants that suppress both progesterone and thyroid hormone. So it's I think ovulation should be perhaps perceived as nature's way of protecting yourself on a monthly basis because you get to produce more progesterone.
It's also it's an antidepressant, right, as well, like it elevates mood and all kinds of things. So
if you just look at, and I've read a lot of Katharina Dalton's work, and I'm not sure I've ever mentioned this before, but she testified against a woman who'd been being tried for murder for killing her husband, and she was showing that actually the psychosis she experienced was an effect of estrogen. So estrogen actually is kind of more like if you have a large amount of estrogen circulating in the body, the capacity of estrogen to make cells accumulate water, also to increase the amount of calcium that enters the cell. It makes them very excitable and very waterlogged. Now, if you get that going on in the brain with an excess of estrogen, it can cause quite abrupt changes. If you think about, when somebody drinks excess amounts of water and dies from hyponatremia, i.e. not having enough salt in the body, you can perhaps, I'm not saying this is perhaps totally true, but you can perhaps see the analogy between the psychosis that's induced from, having a waterlogged brain and experiencing these kind of, some women do aggressively change during their menstrual cycle because of a lack of progesterone and an excess of estrogen that helps water to accumulate within sensitive nerve structures within the brain, the central nervous system, the brain tissues, altered signaling. It becomes quite waterlogged. There's an excitability, as I said, because calcium can enter the cells. So you don't get a normal kind of firing nervous system. And when it comes back to acting as an antidepressant, this is primarily why, and why you tend to see so many females do so much better by having adequate progesterone, whether it's improving that through nutrition, getting adequate light, taking supplemental progesterone. It all has its place. And, I have seen so many female clients just respond so well by saying, I feel so much more relaxed. I feel so much more grounded. I don't get PMS anymore. And I think it's the eradication of PMS by use of supplemental progesterone that should be used as a key driver for some of the key changes that you might see as transitioning through menopause. And I think maintaining adequate natural progesterone can be really, really helpful, especially from that mood perspective.
So then how are we affected by all this by taking the pill? Because the action of the pill is to suppress ovulation. And I know a lot of people take it for many different reasons other than contraceptive. And I feel like it's still a big solution for a lot of doctors. Or I have this problem, a skin problem, endometriosis, or this. it's almost like women are just told, well, what you do is you take the pill until you want to get pregnant. And then when you want to get pregnant, we do fertility treatment. And then when you go through menopause, we'll just do HRT, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
What is the action of the pill that suppresses all these symptoms, and how does that affect what we experience in menopause later in life?
Well, it can be quite varied sometimes. Sometimes it can stop the menstrual cycle. Sometimes it can actually seem to improve it on some level, some cases. And I think that's probably occurred more with the synthetic progestins. But, I took on a new client today who had, she was taking oral contraceptives for 15 years, developed a prolactinoma. Now, a prolactinoma, for just to break down some of the basics within the pituitary, it used to be a relatively uncommon tumor development in the brain. Now, it comes from the pituitary. So the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, is where we get our hormones, thyroid stimulating hormone, our gonadotropin hormones like luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which are both important for male and female reproductive ability, or certainly maintaining the structures and stimulating the production of androgens and sex hormones. Then we have growth hormone, and we have prolactin and the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, I see the pituitary as being more of a stress response. It's a fallback mechanism when we don't have, systemic peripheral conversion of hormones. Now, as I said, this particular tumor, which is prolactin is often upregulated by estrogen. So the oral contraceptives containing estrogens, and to a degree, sometimes progestins might actually do this as well, because they can have an estrogen-like effect, is that you tend to see quite a lot of cases of prolactinomas, this tumor that grows on the pituitary itself. And that can actually grow quite big. Now, you can get other tumors on the pituitary that also produce other hormones, but the prolactin secreting tumor is probably one of the most common now. And estrogen does sensitize the pituitary to produce more prolactin. That's why we can see many problems associated with the increased estrogen and prolactin production. It can suppress thyroid physiology. It can cause stressed people to produce milk and lactate, including males. It can have varying effects on tissues. But as I said, the brain is a very sensitive structure. When thyroid is suppressed and estrogen is dominant, the likelihood of this prolactinoma, which I said is very common, that there are more of them around for sure. And then you start producing vast amounts of these hormones, which can have, systemic effects around the body. Now, if you come into structures that are quite sensitive themselves, the reproductive tissue, ovaries, endometrium, uterus, breasts, as an example. These are and even the thyroid as well. Estrogen has a relationship where that seems to be fairly pertinent, but tends to be suggested as being more of a relationship rather than a causation at the moment. But thyroid nodules and estrogen dominance seems to go hand in hand. And also fibroids, kind of cystic ovaries, can also pair with that. But again, when you start measuring thyroid by just looking at the blood tests during these states, it can take a while for them to give an optimal presentation. So I think that the oral contraceptive will have a varied effect in some, but sometimes you end up dealing with an accumulation of estrogen over time. And it might take 10 years for it to show the negative features. It might take a week or two to show the negative features. I've certainly had my fair share of clients that said I was put on an oral contraceptive and I felt like I was going crazy, and I stopped within the space of a week or a month or so. So you can see these very acute kind of dark effects, or you can see them that kind of plod along probably slightly more subtly and might end up with, it might end up with fibroids, might end up with blood sugar dysregulation. Certainly oral contraceptive use and even HRT, as an example, is associated with worsening glucose profiles over time. So they can lend themselves to the diabetic state as well. An increase in estrogen also associated with increases of TSH, suggesting that thyroid hormone is often decreased and causes problems to any structure. We know that thyroid hormone is instrumental in physiology at every single level. So if you're losing thyroid hormone, you're losing the ability to regulate your cycle properly, you're losing the ability to warm your body properly, to have good digestive function, good cognition, good mental ability. So I think that the high estrogen will kind of have a very chaotic effect over time.
And I noticed that some women are actually suggested in menopause to take the mini pill to suppress their menopause symptoms. Yeah. How does that work? And what's the effect of that?
Well, I think it's the same. Is the mini pill? Is it a progestin? I think it's just a lot. Yeah, or is it a joint one, like a dual estrogen progestin?
Well, you can take it when you're breastfeeding. Apparently, I'll say that in air quotes. It's often what they'll prescribe you when you're breastfeeding as well, because it's such a low dose. But yeah, I have quite a few clients who just seem to be on that as an HRT for menopause.
Well, it goes back to the kind of the well-versed question: is estrogen really lost at menopause? Mm-hmm. So if you're getting super physiological doses of estrogen, as I said, they can accumulate in the liver. You can promote vitamin deficiency, like a thiamine deficiency, because estrogen will kind of, if you're having to metabolize estrogen at the liver over and over again, it will deplete B vitamins and kind of disrupt some of the energetic processes going on at the liver. It will decrease thyroid hormone function. It can have a chaotic effect on the vascular structures. It can perhaps in the long term lead to kind of hypertension. We know that it's prudent for many women to be monitored on hormone replacement therapy because of the incidence of coronary issues like thrombotic effects, like cystic breasts. And I think it's short-sighted, and I think it's still lazy just to say that estrogen is lost at the menopause. And depending what's in the particular pill will kind of perhaps dictate long-term. But some people can tolerate it okay. Some people aren't aware of it's a bit like the role of kind of pollutants in cancer. Sometimes you don't notice that something. It could take 15 to 20 years for something to manifest itself before you see, structural changes that are associated with disease. So sometimes it becomes inherently difficult. But for some, as I said, it can be almost immediate, the negative symptoms that are being observed, and a need to kind of evaluate whether this is the right thing for you.
So for everybody listening, I hope you're not thinking, oh my God, I'm just up Sheep Creek without a paddle with this menopause thing because I took the pill for 20 years. And the next problems that we're going to go, when we get to the end, I'm going to ask Tommo, what do we do if we've been on the pill for all of our lives? And what do we do if we've been doing all these things? So I think the next thing that you mentioned and is a huge effect on women is a history of dieting and under-eating, and how that affects menopause, and which is normally coupled with overtraining.
Yeah, I think also the PCOS-like states, which is certainly interesting as well. But to the extent, I mean, I see a lot of ladies who've come to me, and I do a good history, and I also kind of find out what the parents have been up to, because you can often find that a lot of parents have passed on low thyroid traits to them. But equally, the societal effects of what young girls feel that they need to look like has been rampant for decades. And so you always find a history, and not in all by any means, but sometimes a general rule in clients that have kind of hormone and endocrinopathies and issues have had a history of either chronic undereating, sometimes anorexia, sometimes bulimia, sometimes overtraining in the female triad, loss of the menstrual cycle, which I think generally comes down to an energetic loss, not getting enough calories in, not getting enough fat in to allow steroidal hormone conversion. As we mentioned earlier, foodstuffs that contain large amounts of retinol are really great because they enhance steroidal hormone conversion. And so if there's been a history of that, sometimes there can be a number of factors, is that it takes young girls as well. A lot of younger people, boys or girls, men, women, will go through phases of kind of going out and partying, going all through the night, excessive alcohol consumption, eating crap foods, and this can accumulate. And for some, it can be that hormones are disrupted at an early age. For some, you kind of suppress a lot of the symptoms, and it isn't until you start taking control of the issues. It might be something like you kind of get a virus and it takes you a while to get over it, or you've lost your menstrual cycle or you can't get pregnant, or you suffer such bad PMS, you're kind of having problems with holding down a relationship. There are all these things that can be a product of what's gone on in the teenage years. And then when you lump in inheritance on top of that, you often find, if you ask a question like, any history in your family? You go, oh, my mum's just had a hysterectomy, or my dad's on a high blood pressure medication, or he's on a cholesterol medication. There are suggestions that the thyroid is at work here that's been inherited. And sometimes clients have said, oh, I was gaining lots of weight when I was a teenager. I wasn't even eating much. And you're thinking to yourself, well, is there a thyroid issue that's driving this? Then they go on the chronic dieting. Then they try and suppress it. And they kind of keep trying to maintain this kind of low weight by enforcing the stress response. And it isn't until they slow down at some point that they start to notice some of these negative symptoms. And I think they then spend a lot of time unraveling those, coming into towards the menopausal years. And this is when the menopause can be a particular problem if they haven't addressed like thyroid, if they haven't addressed adequate energy, light, not doing the right type of exercise, not getting good sleep profiles, you're not getting enough progesterone. All of these things can be a factor. And even to the extent that, stressful environments and pollution, I think is a huge one. Perhaps even the ideas now that chronic Wi-Fi and electromagnetic frequency exposure might be causing problems as well. Certainly from smaller studies, but not really well. They're not huge, big studies, but they generally show that there's increased oxidative stress at very sensitive, high metabolic rate structures like reproductive tissues, ovaries, testicles, breasts. These can all be problematic when we're kind of in this environment that's stressful, that we're breathing in, something that we're smelling, electronics exposure, blue light exposure, oral contraceptive exposure, pollutants in our food. They can converge and cause problems. So to a degree, it's kind of there's rough and tumble and roller coaster ride throughout life for many, that if you don't get to understand how perhaps the environment's working against you, disorganizing your tissues, how your food has a part to play, what kind of cleaning products you use in your house, or stuff that you put on your body, and what you put in your mouth and drink, and what you breathe, and environments that are quite stressful. Nobody really gets to understand how these factors all converge. And I think all of those factors can be instrumental in kind of menopausal symptoms. So I think there are lots of things that conspire against the individual, whether it's menopause, whether it's a type of disease, and how those symptoms manifest themselves.
I think in our society as well, yes, there are a lot of women who have intentionally dieted or starved themselves in some form, but there's a lot of women who are just so busy and trying to live up to society that they don't eat enough food.
Yeah.
And I think this is really missed. Susie will offer, I don't know about you, Tom, I got so many clients who will do a food log for me, and it's like, you just don't eat enough food. Yeah. It's amazing how little calories women can survive on when they're busy. And also be overweight, surviving on so little calories. So people are constantly telling them to eat less, because overweight must mean that you're low, eating too many calories.
So I think skipping breakfast and coffee breakfasts, is a classic thing as well.
But it's interesting though, because there are quite a lot of, I don't know what word to use, regimes or recommendations for menopausal women to fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's kind of, is it Sarah Gottfried and those kind of doctors prescribing fasting as a solution to menopause and menopausal weight gain. And
well, I mean, I think that's wrought with problems from the start, because I think fasting, as much as I don't think many people need to do it, I think it's a useful activity if you're prone to overeating. You can have windows where you eat and don't eat, and that can be just quite a good way of, if you're prone to overeating and eating lots of food, I think fasting can be quite helpful. But to the extent that, you probably be able to suppress lots of the symptoms, because you're running around off adrenaline and cortisol. And yes, sometimes blood sugar level profiles might improve because you're not eating any sugar at all, but it's not guaranteed that you're going to get success. I'm working with a client who kind of lost all her hair she had problems with alopecia. I'm kind of looking at it. She's been low thyroid for a really long time, not been maintaining any kind of form of, hair growing process. And she went kind of low carb and paleo. And there was she'd grown a little bit of hair back by going carnivore. But then she was just encouraged with the people who she was seeing to go really low calorie with this carnivore. And I've seen it before where they've encouraged people to go their they constant monitor their blood glucose values and go, you need to eat less, And they're eating 800 to 1,000 calories. And with this client I've just taken on, most of her hair has fallen out because of that type of dieting. So you can recommend that, but whether it's a very dangerous approach to say fasting calorie restriction is going to be beneficial, because if your hormones are in a bad place, if you're suppressing your thyroid, if you're suppressing progesterone, fasting isn't going to make those values better. We know that fasting suppresses T3, increases growth hormone, it increases estrogen-like effects. It can play havoc with insulin values sometimes. It can have beneficial effects sometimes, but it can slow down your metabolic rate, make you cold, and make you more susceptible to estrogen effects. So, you need to be very careful. And that's why you've probably seen the same amount of people as me where fasting, calorific restriction has made people's hair fall out. It's made people lose their menstrual cycle. It's made them irritable. They develop insomnia. And a very key component of insomnia is not being able to regulate energy, not having enough energy to allow you to get into deep sleep, not being able to inhibit the states of wakefulness, and combined with inflammation as well. One of the beneficial effects of fasting for some people is that they say, my digestion feels better. Well, a car engine, if you didn't fill it with fuel, you could say it's running, it's running okay because it's not moving. There's no wear and tear on it. If you don't have any petrol in the system, it's just going to stand still. But standing still at some point is going to create some aspects of degradation and damage. And again, I'm using this client that I took on today because it's the most pertinent in my mind. She goes to the toilet once a week at the moment. I took her on, and when she was going carnivore and fasting, she was going to the toilet once every 3 weeks. So you can employ these strategies, but it's a very dangerous step. I don't want to say dangerous, but it's a very interesting knife edge to see which way someone goes with that. And I think if you have been overeating, fasting can be quite useful. But for someone who has a history of undereating, not getting enough energy in, loss of menstrual cycle, amenorrhea, oligoamenorrhea, sleep issues, fertility issues, PMS. Unless you're overeating and consuming vast amounts of food that you shouldn't be, I can't see why fasting benefits anyone. Certainly the idea of autophagy and, cellular biogenesis and breaking down tissues and producing new tissues, that's thyroid hormone dependent. You don't have to be in a calorie restricted state to get those benefits. You need enough energy going into the system being able to use that energy efficiently, and your body being able to use it so that in a good state of organization. And as I said, calorie restriction is okay for some people. Certainly we need a calorie deficit to lose weight. We also need a healthy thyroid to make that happen. We need good sleep wake cycles. We need the ability to perhaps think about the strategy that we're doing, and is it sensible to maintain it over the long term? And I have doubts about those regimes.
So so let's just talk a little bit about, so this is like what we're understanding, it's an accumulative effect of stresses throughout our entire lives that affects how we go through the change. Mm-hmm. And for some women too, you've just helped me with a client of mine who was told that she was going through menopause at 40 and was kind of just told, well, that's it, you're just going through menopause, and then came to see me. So we've been working together on energetics, metabolic function, and she was fasting at the time and paleo and all that kind of stuff because that had been recommended to her for her hormones. And I just want to know, what is the normal expectancy of age to go through menopause, and what should women be doing in their 40s if they're being told they're menopausal?
Well, I remember Ray Peat's book where he talked about I think it was a graveyard in the city somewhere in London. I can't remember the exact graveyard, where a woman died of childbirth who was 68 or something like that.
I've got this written down to ask you about.
Right. And so I think there are kind of cases there where fertility, an offset of senescence and aging is a part of a natural process. And I think the how the environment has got, the stress of the environment and the capacity to alter a parent's biology, so children get inheritable traits. We've seen that decrease substantially. I think, the around about the 50 mark is that kind of average that we're seeing, and we'll have kind of a standard deviation either side of a couple of years. But I think, if you're kind of talking like under 48, I think for me personally, that's where we've started to see an increase in the kind of premenopausal states and going into menopause. So I think in 40s, certainly I've seen someone who's gone into early ovarian failure at 38 through chemical exposure. And they were a very depressed individual. And so I think to offset it as long as you can. But, I still think that there's a lot of things that need to be addressed. I was working with a 65-year-old client recently who was taking antidepressants with very advanced gastrointestinal problems. And, getting her kind of off the antidepressants and onto progesterone was one of the best things that she's done at the age of 65. So there are kind of places for kind of the right therapy here going into older ages that can almost reverse senescence. You're not going to reverse menopause once you've gone through it, but I have had clients who were starting to lose their menstrual cycle, and then they've got them back into the right place, and their menstrual cycles come back again. Now, for some females that have had a lifetime of menstrual cycles, some of them are like, yeah, just take it away from me. I've had enough of it. I don't want it anymore. I can understand why some people might think like that. So, but I think the age, I think around about 50, and the more that you can extend that out from the 50s, the better.
So I guess coming back to that, women being afraid of menopause or this loss of period, like it's a loss of your youth. For some women, it's just like, oh, well, menopause means that you're old. Does it really? I mean, what we've established with this client is if she's experiencing all other factors of health and just loses her period, then she's not really that worried. Yeah. And I have a client in her 70s who recently, got into a new relationship and is very much enjoying the intimacy of that new relationship at 70 years old. Some of the chats are like a 16-year-old, early 20s young gal talking about what she's been up to. Do we have to give up our life just because we went through menopause? Like what should we be expecting in terms of sexual function, libido? Obviously we're going to have some vaginal dryness, but should we just be going, that's it, I don't like having sex anymore, I feel old and dried up? Or should we be experiencing some of the stuff we used to, just in a different way?
I think at some point in age, there is an inevitability of loss of function and senescence, and the fact that clients kind of having sex and getting fruity at that age, I think is brilliant. I think that there are changes that can occur quicker in people, depending on how much kind of stress and damage that they've gone through. How early the ovaries have failed, how early the testicles have failed, whatever the structure is. And I think there are a number of things that you can do to kind of offset that for sure. So, I've got another client who's in her 50s. So, she was loss of libido, vaginal dryness, lubrication, arousal, this kind of things going on. And it was actually getting her T3 levels up that kind of reversed those. So, I think that there are a number of things. The expectation that there's a loss of function that can't be reversed to some degree and certainly maintained for decades more, I think that needs to be entertained. Because there are a number of things, whether it's use of pregnenolone, progesterone, thyroid, and other factors that can help to maintain function. So there's my clock going off here. Don't know if you can hear that. Sorry about that. It's time. So I think that right there, as you start to get older, but I think far too many people kind of think that that's over at the earlier age, to be honest. Go, oh, hands up, oh, this is just me kind of, I'm dying. That's it. All my structures are dying. It's like, no, there's actually, it's a bit like exercise. It's a use it or lose it principle. But to the extent that your biology is organized, you can maintain structures, maintain adequate thyroid hormone, maintain energy going to those structures. They will work, but they need kind of stimulation and use as much as any other organs do.
And obviously a lot of that's going to be dependent on your relationship and your self-respect and love and all that kind of stuff and what's going on in your life. But yeah, I just find it so interesting that I do have a client in her 70s who's very sexual and enjoying a great sex life. And that so many women are feeling like menopause is the end of their sexual life. So if I am experiencing all these hot flushes, what are hot flushes and what are they telling us? Because we're talking, this show's about the body never lies. What is a hot flush telling us in menopause?
Well, you could argue it does a couple of things. One of the ideas I used to entertain is there's the ovaries fail, and when you're not producing enough progesterone, the activation of the adrenal glands to produce more progesterone might be a factor in that. The other idea, as I said, is sometimes if progesterone is failing, estrogen can increase, and estrogen stimulates the production of nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a substantial vasodilator, so it will increase this kind of opening of blood vessels, this flushing, and I think that can happen when estrogen is not being kept in check. Some people suggest that it's the loss of estrogen, but I've seen enough clients who have had taken up progesterone. We've kind of improved their blood pressure regulation, or kind of the ability of the smooth muscle cells of the kind of cardiovascular system to function more optimally. And I've seen these kind of flashes just kind of almost just drop off with these kind of interventions. So I think the idea as well is like, the hot flashes sometimes cause insomnia. There are a number of things that you can do to resolve that, and we can talk about those perhaps. But if you can decrease those hot flushes by I think managing progesterone, there are some cases where I have seen one person who was on HRT do better, but that is in the very much minority by taking estrogen there. I've literally seen one person out of hundreds who've kind of stopped the hot flushes. So I think it's just a response to failing ovarian production of hormones, particularly progesterone.
Right. It's interesting when I think back to when I was on the pill in my 20s, and I went on the pill because I had a skin issue. I was unable to have a proper orgasm when I was on the pill. So I can only imagine that the HRT for some women might contribute to this lack of libido, and because that's actually quite common, I found, with a lot of my clients who come off the pill. They're like, wow, I actually have this libido and now I'm having proper full orgasms easily. And, so that's probably going to be contributing to that loss of libido and loss of sexual experience when you're in menopause.
Sure. Yeah. Again, as we get more stressed out by various hormones not working, that kind of overarching feature of stress kind of changes us physically during a stressful period, right? And I also think, going back to the hot flushes, you can have, stimulation of nerves like the vagus nerve, production of acetylcholine, and estrogen will synergize with this, much like it does in PCOS. As I said, estrogen will kind of cause cystic ovaries, and acetylcholine production will also kind of increase that stress as well. An increase in acetylcholine, this kind of neurotransmitter, can actually, it can cause hot flushes. It can elevate your temperature. It can make you hot and sweaty. And again, these kind of can conspire against a good night's sleep. And that's why kind of hot flushes and feeling hot tend to be cited as a key component of insomnia. But again, if you're not getting enough energy in, I've seen clients in their late 20s that have been experiencing hot flushes and been told they're perimenopausal at the age of 30. And when you look at their diet, they're not eating enough. And when you don't eat enough, you ramp up adrenaline production, you ramp up cortisol production, you ramp up estrogen production. And these can cause the effects of this kind of hot sweats. If you're running off adrenaline, you're having to liberate energy from stored fatty acids. You don't use glucose as much. It becomes more stressful from an energy perspective. You don't produce as much carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a potent vasodilator and it controls smooth muscle cells. That's why a lot of my clients who are having hot flushes, I get them doing bag breathing and carbon dioxide therapy. And I think that works really, really well as a useful adjunct with, say, progesterone as an example.
Found that works really well with clients. You taught me that one. Found that works really well with clients with edema as well. And pre and post exercise edema. And
menstrual headaches as well. And no doubt kind of headaches associated with menopause as well. I think getting enough carbon dioxide into the system that's stressed out, going at altitude, this can be particularly helpful.
Interesting, right? So the other thing that clients concerned about, or sometimes why they normally come and see me, is because they experience an excessive amount of weight gain with this change. And I think that's quite considered normal, right? I remember my mum always going on about the middle-age spread. Be ready. One day you will go through the middle-age spread, she used to say.
But I think as well that can tie in with loss of progesterone, because if progesterone is an anti-estrogen, the capacity to stop estrogen having its effects, and remember, the accumulation of estrogen in structures, it gets kind of absorbed into adipose tissue. It makes you convert, more aromatase is produced, more of testosterone and other hormones are converted to estrogen. So the capacity to increase in estrogen is very easily done. And if progesterone isn't there having that anti-estrogen effect, combined with thyroid, as estrogen increases, we know that thyroid is suppressed, and hence why hormone replacement therapy, if you are hypothyroid going into, or you're being treated for hypothyroidism going into menopause, it's recommended that you have regular blood tests to assess the thyroid. And this is where I think kind of looking at temperature and pulse can be useful combined with those blood tests. But, gaining weight can be a product of high estrogen and low thyroid, inadequate progesterone as well. So loss of the androgens, changes to thyroid physiology might drive that kind of weight gain.
So do you think that, I think I've heard of a lot of women saying that they had a thyroid issue after menopause.
Yeah, which was probably there before anyway.
Well, that was my question, yeah.
Yeah, the argument around subclinical hypothyroidism is tied up rather erroneously in the idea that, they've tried to treat it with, say, synthetic levothyroxine and it hasn't changed anything. But again, with any study, if you're not looking at some of what someone's eating, perhaps got high phytoestrogens, high brassica vegetables in a polluted area, to the extent that you're expecting your hormone test to be, in a controlled environment, it's not really realistic. And also the fact that some people don't do well on synthetic T4, they need adequate T3. They might do better on natural desiccated thyroid. Excuse me. And so it could be there already, and it just takes that time with exposure to estrogens that causes the hypothyroidism over time.
So what can we look out for? Oh, there's one thing I want to ask you about, was bone mineral density.
Yeah.
Seems to go down post-menopause. There's a natural loss of bone as we age. It's not going to be as good, because a lot of that's to do with sedentary lifestyle and not doing enough strength training. But this vast decrease in some women, can you talk a bit about that and what that has to do with our reproductive years?
Sure. Well, the idea about HRT, one of the kind of main tenets behind it was that it was preventing osteoporosis and loss of bone mineral density that you used, like the DEXA scan to go and get that assessed. The problem is that estrogen doesn't restore bone. It prevents bone resorption increasing, but it is not a bone trophic hormone. Progesterone and thyroid are bone trophic hormones. They do build bone and mineral density. Again, another rather problematic idea is that thyroid hormone causes osteoporosis because it increases bone mineral resorption. If you take excessive amounts of thyroid hormone, you will lose bone mineral density. One of the reasons why is because your body requires adequate calcium for muscle contraction and a host of other functions as well. But when you're hypothyroid, your body is particularly on the upper end of the system of function, and it requires more nutrients, more food to prevent that happening. It also ties in with the idea of adequate dairy consumption as well. And, enough females have done enough dieting or kind of gone low fat, not consumed enough dairy, that will increase the amount of parathyroid hormone, which causes more bone resorption. So estrogen, when they take that, it doesn't necessarily it doesn't stop. It doesn't help you gain more bone mineral density, but it prevents further bone resorption. Now, usually as well, when somebody goes on that, there are some studies that show that estrogen therapy has increased bone mineral density, but a lot of those studies are not allowing for often the addition of sometimes vitamin D, of calcium-rich supplements, perhaps changes in dietary lifestyles. And sometimes the DEXA scan, which shows improvement, sometimes it just shows the amount of fluid that's being retained as well. It makes it harder to actually analyze it, because estrogen will make you absorb more water. So it's not always reliable to look at that. But I think you need to perhaps understand the ideas that to prevent osteoporosis, and certainly to enhance bone mineral absorption of calcium, it's instrumental to have adequate thyroid and progesterone. And estrogen, as I said, isn't going to stop that, but it will prevent further bone resorption. But yeah, I think that's another problematic feature.
You published a paper that was interesting. You didn't publish it, sorry. You shared a paper that was interesting the other day about Alzheimer's and dementia and the effects of estrogen and progesterone. What did you learn about that? Because it's interesting, because everyone talks about estrogen being this protective hormone. Like, why are we seeing so much more dementia and Alzheimer's in older women?
Well, I think progesterone is a key player in that. There are quite a lot of trials that have showed very poor effects or neutral effects of estrogen to prevent Alzheimer's disease. There are some papers that suggested that it shows a decrease in the production of beta amyloid. Now, beta amyloid is this kind of it's a protein that basically I'm not sure even it's a protein. It's basically part of the immune system. So it's supposed to be there, and it acts as a scavenger. And but the problem is when beta amyloid becomes misfolded, it adds to these problematic structures that we see within dementia, something called Lewy body structures. You get this misfolding of proteins of the beta amyloids, and it leads to something called oligomerization, which is kind of this clumping of structures within the brain, which reduces the function of the brain. It kind of can have some effect. It can be enhanced with metals. We know that things like aluminium increase beta amyloid accumulation. So some of the idea behind this loss of beta amyloid accumulation is it's a bit like it's a very protective feature to have. So if you're not seeing beta amyloid being formed, sometimes the estrogen restricts that, but sometimes it doesn't do too much with the misfolding, because it's already gone down to the end range. It often can't be reversed, and that's why when you look at all of the estrogen studies, it doesn't point to a very protective effect when it comes to Alzheimer's and senescence prevention. And this is where I think to look at. If you look at, there are quite a few studies with Parkinson's and dementia as well that showing that maintaining thyroid function is very, very key here to preventing that. And there are some cases where Parkinson's and Alzheimer's have improved significantly with thyroid. Progesterone seems to help. Decreasing the stress, being able to get structures in the brain to utilize glucose efficiently. That's why Alzheimer's is often termed type 3 or brain diabetes. It's the inability to utilize glucose. We start going through fatty acids at an aggressive rate. We lose metabolic flexibility within the brain. We don't get enough carbon dioxide being produced in structures. And I think that's why estrogen shows so much problems within these studies, and they keep revisiting it, and they sometimes find a study that's a little bit on the bias side that shows a potential effect, but the vast body of literature shows that estrogen does not prevent dementia. And again, you could argue one of the pathways to be looking at is natural progesterone therapy, because it will, offset the effects of high estrogen that can cause the metabolic chaos within the brain and thyroid. There's also some papers that have shown that methylene blue have actually reversed kind of some of the neurodegenerative changes within Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So that's also something to consider.
When we haven't really touched on sugar, and I think this is an important one because a lot of people think sugar is bad for your hormones, carbs in general. So a lot of women will be put on a low carb diet or a sugar-free diet for hormone. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of sugar in hormones?
Yeah. So again, when it comes to having adequate carbohydrate in the diet, we're kind of aware from something called the respiratory quotient, is that when carbohydrates are burned as a fuel compared to fats, the respiratory quotient is 1 compared to 0.7. That means that we produce more carbon dioxide. When we have more carbon dioxide in the system, it's able to self-regulate the metabolic processes. We know that too much carbon dioxide sometimes needs to be breathed out to buffer. So it's worth not getting confused about the role of what carbon dioxide is and does, and why getting enough carbohydrate in the diet can be important. Glucose is a very easy kind of substrate to use. It doesn't have half the metabolic byproducts, the lipid peroxides that you get from fatty acid oxidation. Of course, what you can have is poor metabolic use of sugar. And far too many times you see high glucose values, hyperinsulinemia. You see perhaps low insulin values in kind of advanced states. And again, it comes to perhaps your ability to be able to metabolize sugar as a fuel. Yes, you can consume too much of it, but the dictation of where too much is can again come back to factors like thyroid function, whether thyroid stimulates the pancreas and insulin production, insulin signaling, thyroid signaling, pancreatic signaling, including digestive enzymes as well, can play a role in that. So it's important to understand that sugar isn't necessarily bad. Can you consume too much sugar? Yes. Can you consume not enough sugar? Yes. Can you consume too much fats? I mean, really high protein diets can have quite a negative effect on insulin as well when you don't get enough carbohydrates and fats in as well. So it's worth taking it in context. You can argue with the ideas of high fructose corn syrup, where you're having kind of very high loads of fructose that can cause problems. But again, even fructose and glucose are not problematic when you get them in the right amount. When the system becomes degraded, as I said, your inability to use sugar is the first thing that's frowned upon. And that's why you see lots of, low carb zealots and carnivore people go, see, look, your glucose levels look great now. Well, you haven't been eating them. But it's like going back to that digestive dysfunction aspect, is where you don't feel like eating very much because you get so inflamed and bloated when you eat. You find that not eating has the most beneficial effect, because you're not going back to sorting out the problem at the source. So you cut sugar out, and if you're someone who's focused on blood glucose values, which can be a bit of a waste of time for some people anyway, is that you're not getting the idea of why glucose metabolism isn't being used efficiently.
And the same goes for protein, right? Like I see a lot of women definitely undereat protein.
Yeah.
Good quality protein.
Yeah, so keeping the liver functioning is extremely important, because it has so many aspects of function. It provides energy, it provides thyroid hormone conversion. We can see large amounts of steroidal hormone conversion. We can see, aspects of degradation of certain hormones. We can see accumulation of fatty acids and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and adequate protein does play a huge role in that, because low protein diets do tend to kind of not help people to convert hormones or kind of maintain an energetic function as much. Obviously, the energy tends to come from breaking down fats and carbs as a fuel, but protein can be broken down as well. But if you get into the state where you're kind of breaking down proteins consistently, you're usually heading towards a bad way and substantial loss of function over time. So yes, getting adequate protein is essential for hormones.
PUFA and the effects on our hormones.
Well, high fat diets are quite interesting, because high fatty acids in the diet can cause displacement of thyroid hormone binding. Now, it's really interesting that the unsaturated fatty acids have a much more aggressive effect on displacing thyroxine T4 from thyroid binding proteins, particularly transthyretin. And one of the suggestions is that transthyretin isn't important in humans as it is in rodents. But once you get into the brain, transthyretin is the most prominent thyroid carrier. And when you start to see loss of thyroid hormone in the brain, this is where we can see issues with kind of disturbances around kind of hormone production, fatigue, central hypothyroidism. We can see other issues take place where estrogen can take a foothold and cause problems. So to the extent that the diet's really high in unsaturated fatty acids, and you get the double whammy effect of the lipid peroxides, you get the highly unsaturated fatty acids produce something called HNE, which can be very problematic. You start to increase the amount of oxidative stress that goes on. And bearing in mind, if your reproductive structures are going through very large amounts of oxidative stress, which they are, coupled with burning or utilizing unsaturated fatty acids, the net effect is a wasting of the antioxidant status, producing something called superoxide, producing superoxide dismutase, which is an antioxidant, and then wasting of another powerful antioxidant, glutathione. So it can have some very nasty effects downstream, which are chronic inflammation. And when we have chronic inflammation from poor dietary intake, particularly oxidized unsaturated fatty acids, which we find in fried food and whatnot, we can find perhaps this inflammatory process is inhibiting hormone conversion, as well as having this effect of inhibiting the binding of the protein that goes into the brain.
So, and I think it's important to understand for people who haven't listened to the other episodes that the polyunsaturated fats, yes, they're high in processed and fried food, but they're also high in vegan, vegetarian diets that are like based all their proteins on nuts and legumes and seeds and salmon, which I see a lot of women, focusing their proteins in those kind of areas because that's deemed as healthier. So yeah, not having enough saturated fat in ratio to polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fats.
Yeah, and you still see demonization of saturated fatty acids. And can you consume too much of it? Yes, you can. But I think a moderate intake of saturated fat is where we should be, because even saturated fat has certain amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids in it anyway. And you're right, the nuts and the seeds, I tell you what, they haven't been, you're not getting nuts and seeds that have been harvested at the local nut farm and you're eating them fresh. You've kind of been sitting around in warehouses for quite a while on end. And even nuts and kind of grains and seeds and stuff can sometimes develop funguses and microestrogens that are problematic on top of these kind of fairly rancid fatty acids that are going to cause you problems. And bearing in mind that when you consume these very unstable fatty acids, they're probably, and as well as being oxidized already, when they go into a body that should be around about 36, 37 degrees temperature, they're oxidizing. And if you don't have adequate vitamin E in there, then they're going to be causing more lipid peroxides. And this is where sometimes you can see the problems with skin, aging spots, oxidized unsaturated fatty acids forming with iron, and, lipofuscin. And you'll see these kind of aging spots, not just in the skin, but you'll see them in the ovaries, in the brain, on the organs. And so, it's just something that isn't really thought about from that perspective of aging and aging of our reproductive tissues.
So what can we do? Because I hope that women of all ages listen to this, and I'm going to try and encourage that. And so what can we do for our daughters who are, growing up? What can women in their 20s do? What can women in their 30s do? Because we've talked about it being an accumulation of stressors, and we don't want to get to menopause and go, oh shit, like so many of our clients have. Right, we want to be preparing, so we can do this for our daughters.
Yeah, I think one of the big ones to start with is not project your own kind of stresses onto your children. That's sometimes quite hard to take on board and deal with, and second to kind of be kind of present on what kind of messages that you're giving them. And I think, understanding that eating food on a regular basis is one, particularly for the developing teenager, is essential. Because the environment does get very, very stressful. And to the extent we get adequate nutrition in, that allows our brain to function, to make choices, that allows our liver to function, that helps with optimal energy production, that helps with systemic function throughout the body, how we get to process and produce thyroid hormones, how we get to produce more progesterone, testosterone, some of the more anabolic protective hormones. This is a product of getting enough energy in. We've kind of evolved as a species by having more energy available to us to let our brain get bigger and process these things. Perhaps you could argue we've gone too far with that, with the amount of kind of very fast overproduced foods that become available. But, I think eating on a regular basis and eating good foods, maintaining function, being kind of present on how you're functioning, and understanding that perhaps a lot of the dietary regimes that we kind of encourage people to do or go through, they're kind of probably driven by not us encouraging to go through them, but sometimes teenagers and young girls and children will look at stuff and go, oh, I'm not that size, I'm not that weight, and encouraging about, just because someone's thin or they have a six pack doesn't mean they're healthy. We see these kind of people drop dead on some kind of sometimes fitness challenges or runs, and saying that obese people do. So it's trying to get that happy medium between good function, but it's not being so bloody thin that you can't function, that you don't have a menstrual cycle, that you can't understand why you're irritable with people. Understanding there are key symptoms that can suggest whether something's working or not, and then kind of being mindful of the idea is your menstrual cycle regular? Do you have a kind of relatively smooth one? Is the absence of PMS there? Do you sleep okay? Do you ovulate? Can you kind of poop 3 times a day? I think these are the kind of markers that people need to look at to get an idea of whether something's working or not. And that's the thing, is understand whether it's working for you or not as a person. Because a lot of the symptoms that you kind of see and work with, they're avoidable. PMS is something that's avoidable. Cystic ovaries, which is 10 to 15% of the incidence in the population, can be avoidable. Unfortunately, there's lots of pollution and lots of companies that have kind of caused that to happen, and some of that's irreversible. But to the extent that you can reverse that to a degree, I think is taking control of aspects of your life, which include good nutrition, eating on a regular basis, and maintaining the processes that allow you to make optimal decisions.
I think from the work that I do with clients, especially the emotional work, when I work with any women who have a history of dieting or accidental fasting, or come to this place where they're experiencing all these hormonal issues, when we do the emotional work, there is a lot of looking at what their parents were like in terms of how they felt about their own body. And so, children notice when you don't eat dinner with the family because you're on a diet, even though you never spoke about being on a diet. And I think, I live in a, middle to upper class area of Sydney, and I think this is really rampant in those kind of socioeconomic backgrounds, as women not eating lunch, not eating meals with families, and sons watch that too, and they pick up on it and they go, my mum never ate anything. She was never happy with her body. She was never happy with the way she looked, and that the children pick up on these things. And, I have a daughter, you have 2 daughters, Tommo, that I'm very conscious of, I'm going through a huge weight loss phase at the moment. I've never mentioned that to my daughter at all.
Yeah.
I do weigh my food in front of her, but I tell her it's because I need to make sure that I'm eating enough, because I want to do all these things. So I think we can reframe things. And because, when you work pro-metabolically, there is such a focus on making sure that you eat every 3 to 4 hours, so she's getting quite I need to eat. And the way that we talk to children about food and I go to the gym because I want to grow my muscles. That's what I say to her. I never ever talk about weight loss. And actually I do. I want to grow my muscles, but I lose fat at rest, not be this ultra skinny person. So I cannot stress enough, women, like you were saying, not parents not putting their stuff onto their children. So they're not doing it discreetly, thinking they're not watching, because they are. And I especially notice with women who have a lot of trouble, sometimes they will just be, well, my mum was always dieting.
Yeah.
And so it's how I connect with her. It's actually how I emotionally connect with her. So they start dieting, so it's like a loss of love and connection kind of thing. So I think we have to be so careful as parents. And also even just like making comments about bodies. Why do we make so many comments? Like
I've even had
amount of friends that I have that like cheer each other, like, oh my God, you've lost so much weight, you look amazing. And they're like, oh, well, I haven't eaten all week. And they're like, oh, but you look amazing. Like, why do we make comments on what people look like?
Yeah.
All these kind of things that play off for daughters. So I just wanted to put that in there because I feel like this is something that's really not talked about. And so what would you say? Sorry, you had something to add there? You've got 2 daughters. How do you feel as a dad with 2 young daughters?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've even had clients come up to me and my mum kept telling me how overweight I was. And it's like kind of set the scene for decades of kind of stress. I failed miserably with the first one, but the second one, she's in good hands.
Well, she lives separately from you, so you can't have as much influence, I think is what you should say.
Yeah, that's probably probably the more positive version of it. Yeah.
This is what I do, the emotional coaching, not Tommo.
Don't come to me for emotional coaching. Please don't.
But, how old's your daughter? She's not that much older than mine, is she? Your second?
No, my second one is 6.
Yeah, so she's 2 years older than mine. So
the eldest one's 19.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because mine comes home. Well, I've heard from other mothers at school that their daughters, or like in groups or whatever, they're 4 years old and they're being told they can't play because their legs are too thick.
What?
Stupid stuff like that. And I was just like, how do we get here at 4 years old? So I think mums really need to pull their head in and do it for their daughters for not drinking.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about, yes, so I guess another key thing is if your daughter is struggling with PMS and acne and issues like that, is not to put her on the pill.
Yes.
And dig deeper into, like, there are reasons why we have such a hard time as teenagers, and that's so much to do with nutrition and environment and stress. And so what about in our 20s and 30s?
I think kind of it's difficult because in 20s and 30s people have different values about what they constitute as having fun and doing the right things. But again, it still comes back to kind of regular exercise, perhaps being introspective of what's working, getting out in nature as well. I mean, I think kind of when you're in a kind of very polluted environment, you do need to consider that, that might not be going as good for you as you think it might be, despite you going, having a good job and being kind of knuckling down and doing stuff. This is where we tend to see lots of things occur, especially with kind of, increased alcohol consumption.
Yes, alcohol. What is the effect of alcohol on estrogen and hormones?
It usually acts as a phytoestrogen, so increases estrogen values.
So, and this is why I think so. One of the biggest things I say to women who are menopausal is to stop drinking until we get this under control, and then learn to drink in moderation. I think that's another problem with our culture, right? There's women reaching for the wine at 4:00 in the afternoon, sometimes earlier, or even that daily drinking. Do you think daily drinking is a problem?
Yes, I do. Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think is this is to get, I don't think you should give up alcohol entirely, because if you enjoy it, you should enjoy it. But what is this? How do we drink alcohol in an appropriate amount, and how can we support ourselves to drink alcohol so it doesn't have this negative effect?
I mean, you can go for the kind of, the spirits, not drinking too much beer or wine, which could be a problem. But if you're going to have a drink like that, just a couple of glasses at the weekend, I think is useful for people who want to kind of enforce some change.
And what about women in their 40s? Because this is where I see, like, especially after having children and stuff, there's kind of this ramping up of wanting to do weight loss and exercise. And, I think what's an appropriate amount of exercise for hormones? And
I think doing strength training probably 2 or 3 times a week and walking on a regular basis is ideal. or if not strength training, yoga or Pilates or something like that. But anything that has an anabolic component to it, adequate rest periods.
And the importance of muscle mass versus losing weight.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Because so many women focus on losing weight and not on how much muscle mass they have. And so let's just talk about some of the interventions that we use. So I guess first thing I want to say to everyone is that both Tom and I would always make sure that nutrition is optimal. So enough calories, right balance of macros to have this foundation of health. And then obviously once that we've established that, made sure it's in place, a lot of women are still going to be experiencing these hot flushes and negative symptoms associated with menopause. What are some of the things that work really well? Not that I think that people should go off and do this on their own, but I think you should probably question what your doctor's telling you to do.
I think certainly adequate progesterone is going to be important. I think also with the hot flashes, I think bag breathing, which will have a double whammy effect of calming down the nervous system, restoring carbon dioxide, helping with vascular relaxation. It will also help with just kind of improving glucose utilization as well. So that's great for sleep and bringing down the hot flashes. I do think understanding what's going on with the thyroid is particularly key. I do think getting adequate salt in the diet is going to be beneficial. Making sure you're getting good up to 5 or 6 grams is going to be key throughout the day. Not going too much on water, getting adequate energy in the form of carbohydrates, moderate amounts of fat, getting adequate dairy to make sure that parathyroid hormones not being increased. I think they're some of the key components need to be considered. Sometimes if there is an estrogen issue, kind of perhaps look at that properly to see if it's really there. Some phytoestrogens seem to work okay. Like sage, for example, might work really, really well. And there's also been shown to lower hot flushes as well. But I think part of that might be working on its capacity as what's called a cholinesterase inhibitor, which is again inhibiting acetylcholine and the cholinergic system.
But it's the same sort of for postmenopausal women. I mean, they might be past symptoms of hot flushes and things like that, and have not had a period for a good 12 months. So they're done with all that, but they're still experiencing symptoms.
Most of the clients that I work with, I don't think there's really a different approach between premenopausal and postmenopausal. I don't think that the basics are the same. Maintaining energy, good sleep, good digestion, absence of PMS, which we obviously wouldn't have in the postmenopausal phase, absence of pain, clarity, ability to interpret situations, cognition, lack of brain fog, all of these things.
And I want to ask you one more question, because a lot of people have really started listening into this, because Libby and I talked quite a lot about it, appropriate cardiovascular exercise, because I think one of the things that people do is as soon as they start to put on weight is they go and run.
Yeah.
And I see these poor women and men running around the park near me, mouth open, breath heaving. What is the problem with that in terms of menopause? Because you talk so much about carbon dioxide and nitric oxide and that kind of thing, and what sort of exercise in terms of cardiovascular should we be doing?
Well, I think it will increase the state of kind of carbon dioxide wasting and lead to something called hypocapnia, which means that when you don't have enough carbon dioxide around, you can't utilize oxygen efficiently. If you can't utilize oxygen efficiently, you kind of stimulate glycolytic processes, which mean you don't use sugar efficiently. So I think this is something that really, really needs to be considered, and not going overboard on breathing through your nose and using that. Some people can run and have absolutely no problems with it, but to the extent your mouth breathing all the time and wasting carbon dioxide could be really problematic.
I mean, I prescribe a lot of steady state cardio, mouth closed, staying in a specific heart rate zone. And I think the only reason why people feel uncomfortable doing that is because they don't really like hanging out with themselves that much.
Yeah, possibly.
So I think you've given people a lot to think about in terms of menopause. I hope you've given a lot of inspiration for younger women to really start taking care of themselves so that they can have a nice, long, healthy, happy hormonal life. Now, if you're a practitioner, if you would like to learn as much as I have from Tommo, could you tell us about your course, please?
Sure, I have a functional hormones and nutrition seminars, which is online, where there's about 23, maybe 24 seminars at the moment, which go through various aspects of kind of hormone regulation, the endocrine system, nutrition, understanding everything from PMS to pituitary tumors, etiology of cancer, restoring blood sugar responses, and also access to the layperson's area, where there's kind of different kind of broken down versions of the seminars as well.
And I found it really helpful. You've helped me with a lot of clients, so you are available to consult for other practitioners, right? And you do take on clients as well. But something really important that Tommo is working on at the moment is his PhD. Please tell us about your PhD and your GoFundMe so we can all contribute.
That's very kind. I'm doing a PhD in researching the effects of multiple pollutants on thyroid physiology, and thyroid ultimately will affect kind of reproductive tissues as well. So I'm kind of starting in the lab in September, looking at how applying multiple pollutants and different types of hormones might create some better type of rescue.
That's cool. So you can go to Tommo's websites what is it? I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Let's GoFundMe. My website's balancebodymind.com.
Yeah, and then your GoFundMe's on that page, right?
Yeah, the link is on there as well.
And the course and everything. And you can find Tommo on Instagram as @Tommo Littlewood. I think it's just me and his mum that call him Keith, nobody else.
Pretty much.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Tommo. I really appreciate it so very much. And we'll see you soon. My pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Littlewood, and you've been listening to The Body Never Lies. If you haven't yet, please go to your favourite podcast app and subscribe, rate and review this podcast. All the resources and references from this episode are waiting for you on my website, littlewood.com. Just click on podcast and look for this episode. Now join me next week for another episode of The Body Never Lies. Thank you so much for listening.